You need to stop pretending she loved you. My son-in-law said it while standing on my front porch less than 48 hours after my daughter died. Not cried. Not collapsed. Not grieving. Just standing there in an expensive black suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, staring at me like I was some inconvenience he needed to remove. The funeral wasn't even over. And yet there he was. Cold. Impatient. Almost angry. You need to be realistic, Gloria, he continued. Amara moved on a long time ago. I remember looking at him and feeling something strange. Not sadness. Not shock. Recognition. Because for the first time in 10 years he wasn't pretending. The mask was gone. And what stood in front of me wasn't a grieving husband. It was a man looking for something. Something he believed belonged to him. Something he thought I had. What he didn't know was that 24 hours before my daughter died, she had quietly transferred $100 million into my name. And I still hadn't opened the final message she left behind. My name is Amara Washington. I'm 63 years old, retired elementary school teacher, widow, mother. And until 2 days ago I thought I understood heartbreak. I didn't. Not even close. Because there are different kinds of loss. There's the loss that comes from death. Then there's the loss that comes from realizing the people around that death were never who you thought they were. And that second loss sometimes hurts worse. My daughter Amara was 40 years old. Brilliant. Elegant. Quiet. The kind of woman who never needed attention because she carried confidence naturally. Even as a little girl, she had this strange calmness about her. While other children screamed for attention, Amara observed, watched, listened, learned. People often underestimated her because she wasn't loud. That would become a pattern throughout her life. And eventually, a very expensive mistake. The world knew Amara Washington Caldwell as a business genius, a technology entrepreneur, a self-made billionaire. Magazine covers, interviews, awards, speaking engagements, the whole thing. But to me, she was still the little girl who used to sit at my kitchen table doing homework while I graded spelling tests. She never changed around me. Not really. Even after all the money. Even after all the success. Even after marrying Richard Caldwell. And that's where this story truly begins. With Richard. Because if you've ever met someone who mistakes wealth for character, you already know exactly who he was. Richard came from old money. The kind of money that never lets you forget it exists. His family didn't just have wealth. They worshipped it. Everything was about appearances, status, connections, last names, memberships. Who belonged? Who didn't? The first time I met Richard's mother, she smiled at me warmly. At least that's what it looked like. Then she asked me a question. A simple question. One that told me everything. And where did you say you taught? Not what subject. Not how long. Not whether I enjoyed it. Just where. I told her. She smiled again. Oh, just one word. But somehow it felt like an insult. You know those moments. The ones where someone manages to make you feel small without technically saying anything wrong. That was Eleanor Caldwell's specialty. And over the years, I watched her teach her son the same skill. The engagement party should have been my first warning. I still remember standing alone near a champagne tower while guests discussed private jets like they were talking about grocery shopping. Nobody spoke directly to me. Not really. They smiled, nodded, moved on, as if I were furniture, as if being a teacher somehow made me invisible. At one point, I overheard Richard's cousin laughing. Well, at least Amara's giving back to the community. The entire table laughed. I don't think they even realized I heard them. Or maybe they did. Maybe that was the point. Amara heard it too. I saw her face change. Just slightly. A tiny tightening around her eyes. She walked across the room, took my hand, and spent the next hour talking only to me. No scene. No confrontation. Just loyalty. Quiet loyalty. That was my daughter. And that's why what happened later hurt so much. Because she spent years protecting everyone else. Nobody protected her. The marriage looked perfect from the outside. Of course it did. Perfect houses. Perfect vacations. Perfect magazine photos. Perfect smiles. But perfection is often where the deepest problems hide. I began noticing things. Small things. Richard interrupting her. Correcting her. Taking credit for ideas she mentioned first. Speaking for her during interviews. Explaining things she already understood. Tiny cuts. Small enough to deny. Big enough to bleed. Every time I brought it up, Amara would smile. I'm fine, Mom. Fine. The most dangerous word in the English language. Especially when spoken by women carrying burdens alone. Then the distance started. Not between me and Amara. Between Amara and everyone else. She became quieter. More guarded. More tired. Sometimes she'd call me late at night. Not to talk. Just to listen. I'd hear her breathing. The silence. The exhaustion. The loneliness. Mom. Yes, baby. You ever feel like people only love what you can do for them? The question hit me hard. Why would you ask that? Long pause. Too long. Then she laughed. The fake laugh. The one mothers recognize immediately. No reason. But there was a reason. There always is. And for months afterward, that question stayed with me. Like a warning I couldn't quite understand. 1 year before she died, Amara started visiting me more often. Alone. No Richard. No assistance. No security. Just her. We'd sit on the back porch drinking sweet tea. Talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes she'd stare at the trees for long periods. Thinking. Watching. Calculating. Almost as if she were trying to solve a problem no one else could see. Then one afternoon she asked something strange. Mom, if somebody showed you who they really were, would you believe them? I looked at her carefully. What happened? She smiled. Again that smile. The one that never reached her eyes. I'm just asking. No. She wasn't. She was testing something. Trying to understand something. And for reasons I couldn't explain, a chill ran through me. 3 months before her death, things became worse. The tabloids started reporting rumors. Business disputes. Marriage problems. Executive resignations. Nothing confirmed. Just whispers. But whispers often come from somewhere. I called Amara. She sounded exhausted. More exhausted than I'd ever heard her. Are you okay? Long silence. Then, I'm learning who people are. The way she said it scared me. Not angry. Not emotional. Certain. Like a judge reading a verdict. What does that mean? And now, I replay every moment. Every sentence. Every glance. Searching for clues. The first clue arrived on a Tuesday morning. She showed up at my house unexpectedly. No assistance. No driver. No warning. Just Amara. She hugged me longer than usual. Much longer. So long that I finally laughed. What is this? She stepped back. Smiled. And for one brief second I saw fear. Real fear. In my daughter's eyes. Then it vanished. Like it had never been there. I love you, Mom. I love you too. She nodded slowly. Almost like she needed to hear it. Almost like she was making sure. Making sure of what? I wouldn't understand until it was far too late. The next day she called me 7 times. 7. My daughter was busy. Powerfully busy. Yet suddenly she wanted to talk about old memories. Family recipes. Dad. Childhood vacations. The time we got stranded during a thunderstorm. Random things. Beautiful things. Things people remember when they're saying goodbye. And somehow, I didn't see it. That's the part that still breaks my heart. I didn't see it. Then Thursday arrived. At exactly 4:17 p.m. my phone vibrated. A banking notification. First I thought it was a scam. The amount didn't even look real. I stared at the screen, blinking repeatedly, certain I was misunderstanding something. Then I saw the sender's name. Amara Washington Caldwell. My hand started shaking. $100 million. Transferred directly into my account. I called her immediately. No answer. Again. No answer. Again. Voicemail. And for the first time in my life, fear wrapped itself around my chest. Because mothers know things. Not details. Not facts. Feelings. Instincts. Warnings. And every instinct I had was screaming. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I just didn't know how wrong. Not yet. Because less than 24 hours later, my daughter would be dead. And before I could even understand what happened, her husband would arrive at my front door, demanding answers, demanding money, demanding things he had absolutely no right to demand. But the most terrifying part? It wasn't what Richard said when he arrived. It was what he already seemed to know. And as I stared into his eyes that morning, one horrifying question began forming in my mind. How did he know about the transfer before anyone else did? And why did he look less like a grieving husband and more like a man whose plan had just gone terribly wrong? The thing about grief is that people think it makes you weak. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it makes you cry in grocery store aisles because you see your daughter's favorite cereal. Sometimes it makes you wake up at 3 in the morning reaching for a phone that will never ring again. But sometimes, grief makes you pay attention. And that was Richard's first mistake. Because while everyone expected me to collapse, I started noticing things that didn't make sense, things that became harder and harder to ignore, including the fact that my son-in-law seemed far more interested in money than mourning. Richard stood in my living room with his hands folded in front of him, not nervous, not heartbroken, not shattered, controlled, careful, watching me, studying me, like a man negotiating a business deal, not a man who had buried his wife. "I know this is a difficult time," he said softly, that fake soft voice, the one rich people use when they're trying to sound compassionate. "Then why are you here?" I asked. A tiny pause, barely noticeable, but it was there. Amara's affairs need to be organized. Affairs, not legacy, not memories, not her life, her affairs. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Her funeral was yesterday. I understand. No, he didn't. Because understanding grief and managing assets are two very different things. And Richard seemed interested in only one of them. Then he said it. The sentence that changed everything. Amara made some unusual financial decisions before her passing. My heart stopped. Not physically, emotionally, because there it was. Confirmation. He knew. Somehow. He knew. I stared at him. Carefully. "You mean the transfer?" His eyes flickered. Just for a second. But I saw it. The relief. Like a hunter finally locating prey. Yes. There it was. No surprise. No confusion. No questions. Just certainty. As if he'd been waiting for me to admit it. And suddenly the room felt smaller. Much smaller. "How did you know about it?" I asked. Richard smiled. Not warmly. Not kindly. Patiently. Like I was a child asking an obvious question. "I'm her husband." That wasn't an answer. And we both knew it. The silence stretched between us. Uncomfortable. Heavy. Dangerous. Then he looked around my modest living room. The same living room where I'd raised my daughter. The same room where we'd celebrated birthdays and graduations and holidays. And somehow his gaze made it feel inadequate. Small. Temporary. You weren't meant to manage that kind of money. There it was. The real Richard. Finally. No mask. No performance. No fake sympathy. Just naked arrogance. I should tell you something about myself. I've spent 35 years teaching children, which means I've spent 35 years listening to people reveal who they are without realizing they're doing it. Children do it openly. Adults do it accidentally. But they all do it. Eventually. And at that moment, Richard revealed exactly who he was. Not a grieving husband. Not a worried family member. A man who believed wealth belonged to certain people. And I wasn't one of them. "You think my daughter made a mistake." I said it calmly. Richard adjusted his cufflink. Actually adjusted his cufflink. As though discussing $100 million and a dead wife were no more stressful than a lunch reservation. "I think Amara was under tremendous pressure." "What pressure?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I don't think that's relevant." I almost laughed. Because whenever someone says something isn't relevant, that's usually the most relevant thing in the room. The next morning things got worse. Much worse. The calls started. First Richard's attorney. Then Richard's financial advisor. Then someone claiming to represent the family trust. Then another attorney. Then another. Each conversation sounded different. But the message stayed the same. The money wasn't really mine. Amara wasn't thinking clearly. The transfer should be reviewed, investigated, possibly reversed. Every call wrapped itself in polite language, professional language, respectable language. But underneath, the message was simple: give it back, and do it quietly. Why would she say quickly? Why would those words matter? The question hit me instantly, and I already hated the answer. If things happen quickly, I need you to remember that I loved you more than anybody else in this world. I broke. Completely. Tears. Sobs. The kind of crying that steals oxygen from your lungs. Because suddenly she wasn't gone. She was right there. Speaking. Breathing. Trying desperately to tell me something. And I wasn't there to help her. Then her voice changed. Stronger. Sharper. Certain. The way she sounded when making billion-dollar decisions. Mom. There are people around me who only understand ownership. I froze. Ownership. Not love. Not loyalty. Ownership. The distinction mattered. A lot. They think marriage means ownership. Long pause. They think money means ownership. Another pause. They think access means ownership. My skin prickled. Because for the first time, I realized she wasn't talking about business. She was talking about her life. Then came the sentence that kept me awake for weeks. Please don't trust anyone who suddenly becomes interested in protecting you. I replayed it. Again. 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 Protecting me. Not helping me. Not supporting me. Protecting me. The exact word Richard and his attorneys kept using. Almost verbatim. And suddenly those conversations felt different. Much different. The message ended abruptly. No explanation. No names. No accusations. Just one final sentence. One sentence that echoed through my empty house. Real love doesn't need control. Then silence. The voicemail ended. And I sat there staring at nothing. For nearly an hour. Because somewhere inside those 8 words was a truth my daughter had spent years trying to survive. The following day brought another surprise. A woman named Denise knocked on my door. Mid-50s. Elegant. Nervous. Eyes red from crying. I had never seen her before. Mrs. Washington? Yes. She swallowed hard. I worked for your daughter. The way she said worked made me pay attention. Past tense. Heavy. Loaded. Fearful. I invited her inside. She refused coffee. Refused tea. Refused water. The behavior of someone carrying information too heavy to sit comfortably with. Finally she spoke. Your daughter trusted very few people. My heart squeezed. Why? Denise looked down. Then toward the window. Then finally back at me. Because she discovered things. The room went silent. What things? Denise hesitated. And hesitation tells its own story. People hesitate when truth has consequences. Mrs. Washington. She lowered her voice. Your daughter spent the last 18 months quietly restructuring almost everything she owned. I stared at her. What do you mean? Assets. Businesses. Property. Investments. Every word increased my confusion. Why? Denise's answer came immediately. Because she'd clearly asked herself the same question 1,000 times. She said she was preparing for impact. Impact. The word landed like a brick. Not uncertainty. Not possibility. Impact. As though she knew something was coming. As though she expected a collision. And suddenly every strange conversation. Every late-night phone call. Every exhausted expression. Every unexplained silence. Started connecting. Not fully. But enough to terrify me. Then Denise said something even worse. About 6 months ago, she stopped allowing Richard access to certain accounts. I blinked. What? Denise nodded slowly. Quietly. Legally. Carefully. The room felt colder. Much colder. Because this wasn't sounding like a happy marriage. This wasn't sounding like trust. This was sounding like preparation. Protection. Distance. Strategy. Did Richard know? Denise laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it wasn't. It was the laugh people make when the answer is obvious. Oh, he knew. A chill ran down my spine. How did he react? Her face darkened. And for the first time since arriving, I saw genuine fear. Not nervousness. Fear. He became very interested in controlling information. Controlling information. The phrase sat heavily between us. Because people who tell the truth rarely fear information. Only people protecting lies do that. And Denise looked like someone who had spent months watching exactly that happen. Before leaving, she handed me a small envelope. No return address. No markings. Nothing. Just my name written in my daughter's handwriting. The second I saw it, I knew. Amara had prepared this. Long before she died. Long before anyone knew what was coming. My fingers trembled. What's inside? Denise shook her head. I promised her I wouldn't open it. Then she stood, walked toward the door, paused, and turned back. What she said next changed everything. Absolutely everything. Mrs. Washington. Yes. If Richard learns that envelope exists. Her eyes met mine. And for the first time, I saw real alarm. Not concern. Alarm. You need to be very careful. Then she left. And I was alone again. Alone with my grief. Alone with $100 million I never asked for. Alone with questions multiplying by the hour. And alone with an envelope my daughter had hidden before she died. An envelope that suddenly felt heavier than anything I'd ever held. I stared at it for a long time. Minutes. Maybe longer. Because deep down, I already knew. Whatever was inside wasn't going to bring comfort. It was going to bring truth. And sometimes, the truth is far more dangerous. Slowly, I slid my finger beneath the seal, opened the envelope, and unfolded the first page. The very first line made my blood run cold, because it wasn't a goodbye letter. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a confession. It was a warning. And the first sentence read, Mom, if you're reading this, Richard has already started lying. I read that first sentence 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I did. And that was the problem. Mom, if you're reading this, Richard has already started lying. The words seemed to vibrate on the page. Heavy. Deliberate. Carefully chosen. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Amara never wasted words. Especially not in writing. Every sentence had a purpose. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. This letter wasn't written by a frightened woman. It was written by a woman who had already reached a conclusion. A woman who had spent a long time gathering pieces of a puzzle. A woman preparing someone she loved for what came next. My hands shook as I continued reading. Please don't panic. The irony almost made me laugh. Every moment she insisted she was fine. She'd been fighting this battle alone. For years. I thought if I loved people enough, they would eventually love me the same way. The next line came immediately after. No transition. No explanation. Just truth. Raw truth. And my heart broke all over again. Because I knew exactly where she learned that. From me. Not intentionally. But still. I spent my life teaching kindness. Patience. Grace. Second chances. And sometimes good people make a dangerous mistake. They assume everyone values those things. They don't. Some people see kindness as weakness. Patience as permission. Grace as an opportunity. And second chances as unlimited resources. Then came Richard. Not directly. Not yet. Amara was building toward something. Carefully. Like a lawyer presenting evidence. Real love creates freedom. I kept reading. Control creates dependency. Another line. Dependency creates fear. Another. And fear eventually reveals who people really are. I felt chills crawl up my arms. Because these weren't observations. They were conclusions. Conclusions earned through experience. Painful experience. Then the letter changed. The tone shifted. The emotional daughter disappeared. The CEO emerged. The strategist. The woman who built an empire from nothing. The woman the world underestimated because she smiled politely. And for the first time since opening the letter, I could hear her anger. Not loud anger. Not emotional anger. The dangerous kind. Quiet anger. Controlled anger. Documented anger. Beginning 18 months ago, I started documenting everything. Everything. That word sat on the page like a warning. I read it twice. Then 3 times. Everything. Not some things. Everything. The room suddenly felt very still. What do you mean, baby? I whispered. as though she could answer, as though somehow she could still hear me. Then I continued reading. Financial conversations, private meetings, recorded phone calls, emails, text messages, business agreements. The list continued for nearly a page, each item making my stomach sink lower, because nobody documents everything unless they've stopped trusting someone completely. Then came a sentence that made me physically stand up. I couldn't stay seated after reading it. I literally rose from my chair. Richard believes I don't notice what he says when he thinks I'm tired. I stared at the page, frozen, and suddenly dozens of old conversations rushed back. Those late-night phone calls, her exhaustion, her sadness, her questions about ownership, about love, about trust. It all connected. All of it. The next paragraph explained why, and it left me speechless. People reveal themselves when they believe they've already won. I sat back down, slowly, because that was exactly the kind of observation Amara would make. Not emotional, psychological, observational, accurate, and terrifying. Then she gave examples, small at first, almost insignificant, comments, jokes, dismissive remarks, the kind people make when they think nobody is paying attention, the kind that reveal character. One example stood out immediately. Richard apparently loved calling people useful. Not talented, not loyal, not kind, useful. Employees were useful, friends were useful, business partners were useful, family members were useful. Everybody existed in categories. Everybody had a purpose. Everybody had value only when providing something. I felt sick reading it, because suddenly his treatment of me made perfect sense. Then I reached the section titled, "The Day Everything Changed." My heart nearly stopped, because unlike the rest of the letter, this section had a title, meaning it mattered a lot. I took a deep breath and read. 9 months ago, I overheard a conversation. That was the first sentence. Simple, direct, but every instinct in my body told me this was important. Very important. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. Another sentence. Those 3 minutes changed my marriage forever. I swallowed hard. My mouth had gone completely dry. The next line shattered me. I heard Richard discussing my death. I couldn't breathe. Not for a second. Not for 2. Not for 5. I simply stared at the page, certain I'd misread it. Certain grief was affecting my judgment. Certain there had to be another explanation. There had to be. There had to. But there wasn't, because the next paragraph removed all doubt. He didn't know I was home. He thought I was traveling. He thought he was alone. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears, so loudly I could barely think. The details were horrifying, not because they were dramatic, because they were casual. Richard wasn't threatening her. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't plotting. He was discussing possibilities, financial possibilities, legal possibilities, inheritance possibilities, as if her death were a business scenario, a hypothetical outcome, a future event to be managed. And somehow, that was even worse. I dropped the letter into my lap. Tears filled my eyes again. Not sadness this time. Rage. Pure rage. Because while my daughter was giving him loyalty, he was calculating outcomes. While she was protecting his reputation, he was analyzing opportunities. And while she was trying to save their marriage, he was apparently preparing for life after it. Then came the sentence that changed the entire story. The sentence that made everything before it seem small. After that day, I hired people Richard didn't know existed. I blinked, then read it again, and again, because suddenly the quiet daughter I thought I knew disappeared. And another version emerged. A version even I hadn't fully understood. A version that had been preparing for war. Silently, patiently, methodically. The next several pages detailed private investigators, forensic accountants, independent attorneys, cybersecurity experts, asset protection specialists, people whose names I didn't recognize, but whose work painted a disturbing picture. Very disturbing. And with every page, Richard looked less like a husband and more like a man running out of places to hide. Then my phone rang. The sound nearly made me jump. I glanced at the screen. Richard. Again. The fifth call that day. I let it ring. Then stop. Then ring again. Then stop. Then a text arrived. We need to talk immediately. A minute later. Another. This situation is becoming complicated. Complicated. My daughter was dead. And his concern was complexity. Not grief. Not answers. Complexity. The choice of words told me everything. I ignored the messages. And continued reading. The next section of the letter was labeled. If something happens to me the second I saw those words. A knot formed in my stomach. A heavy one. The kind that doesn't go away. The kind that warned Mrs. Washington? His voice was clear. Professional. Respectful. Yes. We were instructed to contact you only after you opened the letter. Every muscle in my body tightened. Opened the letter. Not after Amara died. Not after the funeral. After I opened the letter. Which meant my daughter had planned this. Specifically. Carefully. Precisely. And suddenly I knew. These men weren't working for Richard. I opened the door slowly. The older man offered a business card. His name was Harold Bennett. Attorney. The younger man remained near the SUV. Observing quietly. Harold looked exhausted. Like someone who hadn't slept properly in days. I'm sorry for your loss. For the first time since the funeral. Those words sounded sincere. And that nearly made me cry. Because sincerity becomes precious when you're surrounded by performance. Amara hired us 17 months ago. 17 months. The number hit me immediately. Almost exactly the same timeline mentioned in her letter. The timeline when she'd started documenting everything. The timeline when she'd begun pulling assets away from Richard's reach. The timeline when she'd apparently stopped trusting her own husband. My stomach sank. Harold opened a leather briefcase. Removed a sealed package. And placed it on my dining room table. Then he looked directly into my eyes. What he said next changed everything. Mrs. Washington, your daughter believed this meeting might eventually happen. The room fell silent. Eventually. Harold nodded. She didn't know when. She didn't know how. But she believed it was possible. Possible. Not likely. Not guaranteed. Possible. The careful language sounded exactly like Amara. Then he said something that chilled me. She was very specific about one thing. I swallowed. What? Harold took a breath. If I'm wrong, she said, destroy everything. The room seemed to shrink around me. But if I'm right, give it to my mother. I felt tears gathering again. Because even now, even after death, my daughter was protecting me. Harold slid the package across the table. I stared at it, didn't touch it, didn't breathe, just stared. Because something deep inside me already knew. Whatever was inside would permanently change my understanding of Amara's life. And maybe her death. Before you open that, Harold said quietly, there's something you need to understand. I looked up. His expression had changed. No longer professional. Now it looked personal. Human. Heavy. Your daughter wasn't trying to protect money. The statement surprised me. Because that's exactly what everyone else seemed obsessed with. The money. The fortune. The transfer. The inheritance. Yet Harold said it as if those things barely mattered. Then what was she protecting? His answer came immediately. Herself. The word landed harder than I expected. Because suddenly every strange memory returned. Every exhausted phone call. Every forced smile. Every late-night question. Every unexplained sadness. Not a woman protecting wealth. A woman protecting herself. And somehow that was far more heartbreaking. I finally opened the package. Inside were documents. Hundreds of pages. Organized. Indexed. Labeled. Typical Amara. Even in crisis she remained meticulous. The first page contained a single sentence. Typed in bold. If you are reading this, the truth is finally more important than my reputation. I closed my eyes. Because that sentence told me something painful. My daughter had been protecting someone's reputation. For years. And it wasn't her own. The documents revealed a side of her marriage I never imagined. Not physical abuse. Not screaming matches. Not dramatic confrontations. Something far more difficult to explain. Psychological erosion. Slow, subtle, relentless. The kind that leaves no bruises. The kind people don't believe. The kind that makes victims question themselves. Again, and again, and again. There were emails. Thousands of them. Messages that seemed harmless individually, but devastating together. Patterns. Manipulation. Control. Isolation. Pressure. Not enough to alarm outsiders. Just enough to slowly reshape someone's reality. I felt sick reading them, because I recognized something. Amara hadn't stayed because she was weak. She'd stayed because she kept hoping. Hoping each incident was isolated. Hoping each disappointment was temporary. Hoping the man she married still existed somewhere beneath the mask. Then I found the recordings. Not the recordings themselves. Transcripts. Pages and pages of transcripts. Conversations. Meetings. Phone calls. Private discussions. And the deeper I read, the uglier things became. One transcript made my blood boil. Richard was speaking with a business associate. The associate mentioned Amara's success. Richard laughed. Actually laughed. Then said, "People think she built everything herself." A pause. Then another voice asked, "Didn't she?" Richard's response was immediate. People believe whatever story makes them comfortable. I stared at the words. For a long time. Because that sentence wasn't about business. It was about ownership. The same word Amara kept returning to. Ownership. Control. Credit. Power. Then came the bombshell. The thing that made me understand why she'd moved $100 million. Why she'd hired investigators. Why she'd prepared letters. Why she'd planned 17 months ahead. The investigators had discovered something. Something Richard never expected anyone to uncover. A hidden network of shell companies. Secret partnerships. Undisclosed agreements. Money moving in ways that didn't make sense. Nothing outright criminal. At least not from what I could understand. But deeply deceptive. Carefully concealed. And apparently connected to assets Richard believed he would eventually inherit. My head spun. Because suddenly the money transfer looked different. Much different. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic. Calculated. Deliberate. My daughter hadn't panicked. She'd positioned pieces on a chessboard. And nobody realized she was playing. Then Harold interrupted my thoughts. "There's one file you should read immediately." He handed me a smaller folder. Unlike the others, this one contained only a few pages. On the front, written in Amara's handwriting. For MOM only my heart nearly broke again. Even now she was speaking directly to me. I opened it carefully. The first paragraph blurred through tears. Not because it was shocking. That sentence nearly destroyed me. Because how many women had lived that exact story? Giving. Waiting. Believing. Until reality finally answered. Then I reached the final page. And there it was. The first true glimpse of the woman Richard never understood. The woman hidden beneath the patience. The kindness. The grace. The silence. A woman with astonishing foresight. Because at the bottom of the page she had written, "Richard will eventually panic." I froze. The next line. "When he panics, he'll make mistakes." Another line. "When he makes mistakes, don't interrupt him. Let him continue." I stared at the words, slowly realizing something incredible. Amara wasn't reacting to Richard. She was predicting him. Just then my phone rang. Again. Richard. But this time there was a voicemail waiting before I even declined the call. The timestamp showed it had arrived 5 minutes earlier. I pressed play. His voice sounded different now. Not calm. Not controlled. Agitated. The first crack in the mask. Gloria listened carefully. No greeting. No sympathy. No concern. Just urgency. "The people contacting you don't understand what's happening." Interesting. Very interesting. Because he didn't ask who contacted me. He already knew. Then his voice lowered. Almost a whisper. "Some documents can be misunderstood." My stomach tightened. Documents. Not grief. Not family. Documents. The same thing sitting on my table. The same thing Amara had prepared. The same thing he suddenly seemed terrified of. Then came the sentence that made my blood run cold. Whatever Amara left behind. Don't trust it. I stared at the phone. Silent. Motionless. Because that wasn't a grieving husband talking. That was a man afraid of evidence. And deep down, he knew something terrible. Something Amara had predicted long before she died. Because while Richard was desperately trying to control the narrative, he had no idea what else she'd left behind. No idea who else she trusted. And absolutely no idea that in less than 24 hours, the final phase of her plan was about to begin. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Amara's voice. Not the voice from the voicemail. Not the voice from childhood memories. The voice from the letter. Calm. Focused. Certain. The voice of a woman who had already accepted a painful truth. And what disturbed me most wasn't what she'd discovered. It was how long she'd been carrying it alone. 17 months. 17 months of planning, documenting, preparing, protecting, while smiling for cameras, hosting dinners, attending galas, sharing a home with a man she no longer trusted. The loneliness of that realization nearly broke me. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, Harold called. His voice was unusually serious. Mrs. Washington. Yes. We need you to come downtown. My stomach tightened immediately. What happened? A pause. Then. The next package has been released. The next package. Not another package. The next package. As if there had always been stages, phases, triggers, contingencies. Like my daughter had anticipated events unfolding step by step. And somehow, I wasn't surprised anymore. By noon, I was sitting inside a private conference room overlooking the city. The room was filled with people I had never met. Attorneys, financial investigators, corporate compliance officers. 3 individuals introduced only by first names. No small talk. No pleasantries. No wasted words. The atmosphere felt different from anything I'd experienced. Focused. Controlled. Purposeful. Then Harold placed a tablet in front of me. Before we begin, he said quietly, there's something Amara wanted you to see. The screen lit up. And suddenly, my daughter appeared. I stopped breathing. For a moment, I genuinely forgot she was gone. Because there she was, wearing a navy blazer, hair neatly pulled back, looking directly into the camera, directly at me. Alive, strong, composed, and heartbreakingly beautiful. Hi, Mom. My eyes immediately filled with tears. Across the table, nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. Everyone understood. This wasn't a business meeting anymore. This was a daughter speaking across time. She smiled softly. Not the public smile. Not the magazine cover smile. The real one. The one she'd worn since childhood. If you're watching this, things have progressed further than I hoped. Further than I hoped. Not expected. Hoped. The wording mattered. Because suddenly I understood something. Amara never wanted to be right. She wanted to be wrong. Desperately. She wanted her fears to be unfounded. Her suspicions to be unnecessary. Her preparations to be wasted. But she prepared anyway. Then her expression changed. Sadder. Heavier. Mom, I know you're grieving. A pause. I am too. The room fell completely silent. Because in that moment she wasn't talking about death. She was talking about loss. The loss she'd experienced while still alive. The slow death of trust. The collapse of illusions. The heartbreak of realizing someone loves what you provide more than who you are. Then she said something that haunted everyone in that room. Some people don't leave when they stop loving you. Nobody moved. Nobody blinked. Nobody looked away. Sometimes they stay. A pause. Because leaving would cost them too much. I felt chills race down my spine. Because suddenly every document, every recording, every strange conversation made sense. Then Amara leaned slightly forward, looking directly into the camera, directly into my eyes, and said, Richard never understood my greatest advantage. I swallowed hard, because this was it. The reveal. The thing she'd been building toward. The thing she'd hidden for nearly 2 years. He thought money was power. A pause. He thought status was power. Another pause. He thought influence was power. Then she shook her head. Slowly. Sadly. Almost disappointed. No. The room became painfully still. Information is power. Harold lowered his eyes. One attorney actually exhaled. Because everyone in that room already knew what was coming. Everyone except me. And suddenly I understood why. My daughter hadn't been collecting evidence. She'd been collecting leverage. Not for revenge. For protection. There is a difference. A huge difference. Then Amara said 6 words that changed everything. I never stopped paying attention. I felt tears roll down my face. Because that was her. Always. Watching. Listening. Observing. The quiet little girl at the kitchen table had never disappeared. She had simply grown up. The video ended. Nobody spoke. For nearly 30 seconds. Then Harold slid a folder toward me. Unlike the previous files, this one contained a single label. Project Sentinel. My heart skipped. What is this? Harold looked at me carefully. Your daughter's contingency plan, behavioral events, even communication patterns. Every trigger produced consequences. Automatic consequences. Consequences nobody could stop. Not even her. I stared at page after page in disbelief. Because while Richard believed he was controlling the board, Amara had redesigned the game itself. Entirely. Then came the revelation. The one that finally explained the $100 million. The one that explained Richard's panic. The one that explained everything. My daughter wasn't worth $100 million. She wasn't worth $1 billion. She was worth significantly more. Much more. The transfer wasn't her fortune. It was a fraction. A carefully calculated fraction. I looked at Harold. Confused. What are you saying? He took a breath. Then answered carefully. The public estimated your daughter's net worth at approximately $1.8 billion. I nodded. That was what everyone reported. What everyone believed. What every magazine published. Then Harold delivered the bombshell. The actual figure was considerably higher. I stared. Speechless. How much higher? Nobody answered immediately. Which somehow made it worse. Finally one of the investigators spoke. Mrs. Washington. A pause. Amara's private holdings exceeded $8 billion. I nearly dropped the folder. $8 billion. The room tilted. Literally tilted. I grabbed the table. Trying to steady myself. Because suddenly I wasn't mourning a wealthy daughter. I was mourning a woman whose true success almost nobody understood. Including me. And Richard didn't know. That was the stunning part. He knew she was rich. He knew she was successful. But he didn't know how successful. Because she had quietly separated enormous portions of her empire. Layer by layer. Year after year. Using structures invisible to outsiders. Invisible even to him. Then another revelation arrived. One even more satisfying. Many of those structures no longer benefited Richard at all. Not indirectly. Not eventually. Not legally. Not financially. Not in any meaningful way. The moment certain conditions were met. Everything changed. Automatically. One investigator opened a chart. I looked down. And suddenly understood why Richard had been panicking. Because the chart showed something extraordinary. Nearly every aggressive action he'd taken after Amara's death had triggered protections. The legal threats. The pressure campaigns. The attempted asset claims. The intimidation. Each one activated another safeguard. Another restriction. Another barrier. It was like watching someone step deeper into quicksand. By struggling. Then Harold smiled for the first time. A small smile. But a real one. Your daughter called it the arrogance trap. I blinked. The what? The arrogance trap. He actually laughed softly. She believed certain people become predictable once they feel entitled. I couldn't help it. I smiled through tears. As that sounded exactly like Amara. Exactly. The trap was simple. Richard believed control was his greatest strength. So every safeguard was designed around that belief. The more aggressively he tried to seize control, the more power he lost. And he never realized it. Not until it was too late. Then came the final document. The document nobody had shown me yet. The one everyone seemed hesitant to discuss. The the one that had changed the atmosphere in the room. Harold placed it carefully in front of me. Very carefully. Almost respectfully. And I immediately knew why. Because at the top was a single name. Richard Caldwell. Underneath it, confidential findings. I opened it. Read the first page. Then the second. Then the third. And slowly, the entire room disappeared. Because what I was reading wasn't evidence of greed, or manipulation, or arrogance. Those things were already obvious. No, this was something bigger. Much bigger. Something Richard had spent years hiding. Something capable of destroying the carefully crafted image he worshipped. Something that explained why Amara eventually stopped trying to save the marriage. Something that explained why she'd finally accepted reality. I looked up, stunned, speechless, heart-pounding, because the secret wasn't financial. It wasn't corporate. It wasn't criminal. It was personal, deeply personal, and devastating. Just then Harold's phone rang. He answered, listened, said nothing, then slowly lowered the phone. The color drained from his face. Every person in the room noticed. Immediately. What happened? Someone asked. Harold looked directly at me. And for the first time since meeting him, he seemed genuinely shocked. Richard just filed an emergency petition. My stomach dropped. For what? Harold's expression hardened. Then he delivered the sentence that made everyone in the room go silent. He wants the court to declare Amara mentally incompetent during the final months of her life. I felt rage explode inside me. Not sadness. Not grief. Rage. As now I understood. The money. The pressure. The threats. The urgency. The lies. He wasn't trying to recover assets. He was trying to erase her credibility. Erase her decisions. Erase her voice. Even after death. But what Richard didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the very secret he was desperately trying to keep hidden was about to be revealed to the world. And when it was, nothing in his carefully constructed life would survive the fallout. I wish I could tell you that I was shocked by Richard's court filing. I wasn't. Not anymore. At that point, I had spent days reading my daughter's letters, reading transcripts, reviewing evidence, listening to recordings, watching the truth unfold piece by piece. And one thing had become painfully clear. Richard wasn't fighting for love. He was fighting for control. The same control Amara had spent years quietly slipping out of his hands. The same control he thought belonged to him. The same control he still believed he could reclaim. Even after her death. Especially after her death. And that's what made what happened next so devastating. He truly believed he was going to win. The hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later. 3 weeks of media speculation. 3 weeks of legal maneuvering. 3 weeks of whispers. The story had already started spreading. A billionaire's mysterious death. A surprise fortune transfer. A grieving mother. A wealthy husband challenging his late wife's final decisions. People had opinions. Lots of them. But almost nobody knew the truth. Not yet. The morning of the hearing, I stood outside the courthouse feeling strangely calm. Not because I wasn't nervous. Because I was. Terribly nervous. But Amara's words kept replaying in my head. Real love doesn't need control. Again. And again. And again. The phrase had followed me through every sleepless night. Every painful memory. Every difficult conversation. And somehow it kept bringing me back to center. Back to dignity. Back to peace. Richard arrived surrounded by attorneys. Expensive attorneys. Confident attorneys. The kind of people who bill by the hour and smile with the same lie he'd built his entire strategy around. The same lie he needed everyone to believe. The same lie that was about to destroy him. I smiled softly. Not because anything was funny. Because suddenly I could hear my daughter. I could almost feel her standing beside me. Calm. Patient. Watching. Waiting. The way she'd always done. Then I said something that made Richard freeze. That's going to be difficult to prove. His face changed instantly. Because for the first time, he realized I knew something. Something important. Something dangerous. The hearing began. And for nearly 2 hours, Richard's legal team argued their case. They painted a picture. A very careful picture. A grieving woman. Emotional distress. Poor judgment, mental fatigue, isolation, manipulation. Every argument pointed toward the same conclusion. Amara couldn't be trusted. Not during her final months. Not when she transferred the money. Not when she made her decisions. Not when she changed her estate plans. The strategy was obvious. Destroy her credibility, and everything else would fall apart. Then Harold stood, and everything changed. The room became quiet. The kind of quiet that only happens when people sense something important is about to happen. Harold approached the podium, placed a folder down, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "we'd like to introduce approximately 18 months of evidence demonstrating not only Ms. Washington Caldwell's mental competence." A pause. But her extraordinary strategic planning. The room shifted, physically shifted. People leaned forward. Attorneys exchanged glances. Richard's expression hardened. Then came the videos. Not one, not two, dozens. Recorded presentations, board meetings, investor briefings, strategic reviews, complex negotiations. Every single one occurring during the exact period Richard claimed she was mentally compromised. Every single one. And in every recording, Amara was brilliant, sharp, focused, precise, operating at a level few people in the room could match. The argument collapsed almost immediately, but that was only the beginning. Then Harold introduced Project Sentinel, the contingency system, the documented timelines, the independent evaluations, the forensic reviews, the legal protections, the hundreds of pages demonstrating deliberate, rational strategic planning. The deeper the evidence went, the worse things became for Richard. Because every safeguard she'd created told the same story. A woman thinking clearly. A woman planning carefully. A woman anticipating future behavior, including his. Then came the moment nobody expected. Not even me. Harold paused, opened a smaller folder, and said, "There is one final matter." The room went silent. Completely silent. Then he continued, "We believe the court deserves to understand why Ms. Washington Caldwell began documenting these events in the first place." My pulse quickened, because I knew what was coming. The secret. The thing hidden inside the confidential findings file. The thing Richard feared most. Richard stood immediately, his face pale. Objection. His voice sounded strained, almost desperate. The judge looked at him. On what grounds? His attorneys scrambled. Papers shuffled. Whispers exchanged. But it was already too late, because panic had arrived. Exactly as Amara predicted. "Your Honor," Harold continued calmly, "the respondent's actions are directly connected to a pattern of deception that began years earlier." Richard looked like he couldn't breathe. And suddenly I understood why. Because the truth wasn't merely embarrassing. It destroyed the identity he'd spent his entire life selling. The evidence showed something astonishing. For years, Richard had carefully cultivated the image of being the architect behind Amara's success. The strategist, the advisor, the guiding force, the man behind the empire. Privately, he encouraged people to believe it. Professionally, he benefited from it. Socially, he enjoyed it. And Amara let it continue. For a while. Because she loved him. But the investigation uncovered something else. Something devastating. The opposite was true. Completely. Painfully. Undeniably. Amara wasn't benefiting from Richard. Richard was benefiting from Amara. Every major breakthrough. Every major acquisition. Every major strategic decision. Every major expansion. The evidence pointed back to her. Not him. Her. Again. And again. And again. The room became uncomfortable. Then embarrassed. Then stunned. Because suddenly people weren't looking at Richard with admiration. They were looking at him with recognition. The kind nobody wants. The kind that strips away illusion. Then Harold played a recording. A private recording. One Richard never knew existed. His own voice filled the courtroom. And the room froze. In the recording, Richard was speaking with an associate. Laughing. Relaxed. Careless. Certain nobody important would ever hear it. Then he said the sentence that ended everything. People don't need the truth. Laughter. Then. They just need a story they can repeat. Silence. Then another voice asked, "What happens if she leaves?" Richard laughed again. The answer came instantly. "She won't." A pause. Then, "She still believes loyalty changes people." The courtroom went dead silent, because in 12 words, he revealed everything. His arrogance, his manipulation, his contempt, his certainty, everything. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I wasn't in a courtroom. I was back on my porch, back in my kitchen, back listening to my daughter ask whether people only loved what she could do for them, back hearing the exhaustion in her voice, back seeing the sadness she tried so hard to hide. And for the first time, I truly understood. When I opened my eyes again, Richard looked smaller. Much smaller. Not physically. Emotionally. The image was gone. The illusion was gone. The performance was over. And everyone could see it. Including him. The judge ruled several hours later. Every challenge denied. Every claim rejected. Every attempt to invalidate Amara's decisions failed. Completely. Decisively. Publicly. But the legal defeat wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came afterward. The consequences. The collapse. The exposure. The people who quietly stepped away. The business relationships that disappeared. The invitations that stopped arriving. The phone calls that stopped being returned. The reputation he spent years building began crumbling. Not because Amara destroyed it. Because the truth did. Several months later, I received one final package. The last package. The one Amara instructed Harold to deliver 6 months after everything ended. Not immediately. Not during the chaos. After. When the noise faded. When the anger settled. When healing could finally begin. Inside was a handwritten letter. Only 3 pages. The shortest letter she'd left. And somehow the most powerful. "Mom," it began. "If you're reading this, then you survived the storm." I smiled through tears. As that sounded exactly like her. Exactly. Then she wrote something I'll carry for the rest of my life. "Please don't spend your future fighting my past." I sat quietly for a long time after reading that. As she was right. Again. There would always be another lawsuit. Another rumor. Another argument. Another grievance. But peace requires a choice. Sometimes dignity means walking away. The final page contained her last lesson. Not about money. Not about power. Not about success. About class. Real class. The kind her in-laws never understood. The kind no amount of wealth can purchase. She wrote, "Real wealth is being able to sleep peacefully. Real power is being free. Real class is treating people well when you don't need anything from them." I cried harder reading those lines than I had during the hearing. Because those weren't business lessons. They were life lessons. And they perfectly described the woman she became. A year later, I sold my house. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to. I moved closer to the ocean. Bought a comfortable home. Nothing extravagant. Nothing flashy. Just peaceful. The way Amara would have liked. One afternoon, I met an elderly woman while walking along the beach. We sat together watching the waves. Talking about life. Loss. Family. Time. Eventually she asked if I had children. I smiled. And looked toward the horizon. "I have a daughter." The woman noticed the emotion in my voice. "Tell me about her." So I did. For nearly an hour. I told her about the little girl who loved books. The teenager who asked difficult questions. The woman who built an empire. The daughter who never forgot where she came from. The woman who quietly protected everyone she loved. Even when nobody realized she was doing it. When I finished, the elderly woman smiled. Then she said something beautiful. Something simple. Something true. "She sounds wealthy." I laughed softly. Because she had no idea. No idea at all. Then I shook my head. And answered, "No." A pause. "She sounds free." And that's the difference. The lesson hidden inside everything that happened. Money wasn't the story. The fortune wasn't the story. The inheritance wasn't the story. Freedom was. The freedom to see people clearly. The freedom to stop carrying other people's burdens. The freedom to choose dignity over approval. The freedom to walk away from relationships built on control. the freedom to live honestly, and eventually, the freedom to find peace. Today, when people ask about the money, I usually smile, because they're asking the wrong question. The money helped. Of course it did. But it wasn't the greatest gift my daughter left me. The greatest gift was truth. The truth about who she was. The truth about what mattered. The truth about real wealth. And the truth that love without respect is never really love at all. So let me ask you something. What would you have done if you were in Gloria's position? Would you have trusted Richard? Would you have opened that first letter immediately? And do you think Amara knew exactly how everything would unfold? I genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Tell me where you're watching from and what part of this story affected you the most.